Preservation at Ball State. And on behalf of the College of Architecture and Planning, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's lecture, which is another in this year's guest lecture series of the college. First, I would like to acknowledge the presence of some special guests. President John Worth of the University is with us. Thank you, John, for coming. Provost Warren Vanderhill is here, and Mrs. Sandra Marsh, who's a special assistant to the president, and we welcome you and appreciate your presence. We also have a nice representation of people here from various preservation and historical organizations from Muncie and the surrounding area, and possibly even some members of the Muncie Bar Association, if we were invited. And so we'd like to extend a welcome to all of you as well. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to announce that the Associated Students of Historic Preservation, our organization of graduate preservation students, are going to host another of their sumptuous receptions in the hallway immediately outside the hall. And we'd like to invite all of you immediately following the lecture to meet our guest lecturer and mingle with others present. Tonight's speaker, Randall T. Shepard, became Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court in 1987. He was then the youngest Chief Justice in the nation, an indication of his keen abilities as a judge and as a legal thinker. Since then, he has assumed national leadership positions in the American Bar Association and the National Conference of Chief Justices, and has authored over 400 majority opinions for the Indiana Supreme Court. Previous to his appointment as Chief Justice, Judge Shepard served as an Associate Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court, a trial judge in the Vanderburg Superior Court in Evansville, and as an executive assistant to former Mayor Russell Lloyd of Evansville. He holds a degree in urban affairs from Princeton University and law degrees from Yale University and the University of Virginia. During the past 2 decades, Chief Justice Shepard has also become a leading advocate for historic preservation in Indiana. When I first met Randy in the late 1970s, he was one of the leaders in organizing the Conrad Baker Foundation in Evansville to save the historic Vanderburg County Courthouse and also the old Custom House there in Evansville. After moving to Indianapolis in 1985 to join the state Supreme Court, he was elected to the Board of Directors and then subsequently as chairman of the board of the Historic Landmarks Foundation in Indiana, which is the principal historic preservation organization in the state. He also assumed national prominence in historic preservation through his service as a trustee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He and his wife, Amy McDonald, have restored a house in the historic Meridian Street district of Indianapolis, and they are both very active in preservation concerns. In 1991, Randy Shepard gave one of the major addresses to the annual meeting of the National Trust for Historic Preservation in San Francisco. His address, which made quite an impression on his audience, challenged those present to rethink the role of American cities in the future and to employ new strategies to incorporate urban values into public policy. Tonight, Chief Justice Shepard is going to challenge us with his latest thoughts on the importance of urban areas, reaffirming the value of American cities. Will you please join me in welcoming Randall Shepard.
Very much. Thank you, Jim. Class. Jim reminds me of one of the most unusual circumstances I was ever invited to speak. It was the speech in San Francisco. Some not too many years distant. I got a call one day from someone at the National Trust who said, the governor of California is going to be our keynote speaker for the convention. Great. But it seems that the governor vetoed a gay rights bill last week, and his staff called and said maybe you wouldn't want him to come to San Francisco to address the convention, because every time he shows up, there are protesters who surround the building as a result of this recent action. And he said he'd come, but he also suggested that maybe somebody a little calmer and quieter and less controversial might be better as a speaker, and I said that would be fine. I'm happy to report not a single protester anywhere around the hall, but to this day, one of the most unusual experiences I've had as being invited. Well, I thank Jim Glass and his colleagues for inviting me. I thank President Worthen for coming to hear what I have to say. It's been a splendid afternoon. The school had a chance to spend some time with graduate students and to get a tour of this building, which in all the time I've been involved in solid contribution of this faculty and its graduates, and therefore ultimately the present students, make to our state. It's really a pleasure to come and be associated with you. With respect to American cities, I can begin by predicting that within about 3 weeks, there will be articles in most American newspapers noting the anniversary, the 4th anniversary of a sad event, the riots in South Central Los Angeles, which were set off by the famous beating of Rodney King. And there will be stories about what South Central LA is like today, and about what has worked well and what hasn't, and mostly the stories will say that there's a lot that hasn't worked. And the presentation and the prominence of those stories will, I think, if anything, demonstrate the truth that underlies the points I want to make with you tonight, which is that in the last decade and a half, the saving of American cities has fallen off the scope as far as most Americans are concerned. Now, the future of historic preservation and the future of American cities is inextricably linked. And this is as good a time as any to renew the claim that cities have had on the national agenda generation after generation. And I'll put it to you that presidential election is a good moment to renew that claim. Now, Americans have always had a kind of love-hate relationship with cities. We were in our early days an agrarian society, one that was seen as an excellent destination for people pouring out of Europe, fleeing the ancient cities, fleeing congestion, fleeing tyranny, fleeing economic deprivation. Those are the reasons my ancestors came. Fleeing the potato famine, fleeing the Prussian draft, and a host of other reasons. And they looked to this great open land as a place for salvation. But of course, when they arrived, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century had created cities that looked an awful lot like the cities in Europe. They were crowded, they were sooty, congested, they were full of industry and full of pollution. In short, there weren't very many alabaster cities in 19th century America, and they didn't gleam all that well. They were busy, human places. And when Lincoln Steffens wrote about the shame of American cities, he accurately described what most 19th century American cities were like. They were places many Americans weren't really sure they wanted to inhabit. Just before the turn of the century, though, Americans captured enthusiasm for a new kind of city, based on the gleaming vision embodied in the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. This vision was one chock full of hope and optimism, and it eventually gave rise to the City Beautiful movement. Simply put, Americans decided that Paterson, New Jersey wasn't the only way you could organize a city. And they said, more or less, we can do better. Let's do something beautiful. Now, in the teens and 20s, the City Beautiful movement and the progressive movement, the political part of the City Beautiful movement, bloomed in the Midwest. Many Americans were determined to prove that they could build a better physical city and build a society of greater civic virtue. Developments in my own hometown of Evansville were typical of this era. The citizens lifted up a brand new baseball stadium, 1906. They named it after their energetic mayor and plastered on the side of it his civic slogan, "When everybody boosts, everybody wins." It was a classic progressive era idea. And they put it right smack in the center of a City Beautiful park, full of sculptured hills, rolling man-made lakesides and decorated bridges. This era of exuberance, experimentation continued throughout the 30s and 40s in places like Beltsville, Maryland, and even in places like Levittown, if you will, out of Long Island, where Mr. Levitt decided to create a new kind of American city. This particular kind of city turned out to be ultimately harmful to traditional American cities, but it was still part of the idea that Americans could do better in building urban places. The commitment to build better cities was apparent in both the private sector and the public sector. It wasn't just something that great philanthropists and fine designers did in places like Marymount, Ohio. More important, it was part and parcel of the national political agenda as far back as the Eisenhower administration. You should recall that one of those first great evils of preservation, the urban renewal program, began in the Eisenhower administration's programs for reasons that were mostly positive. People committed to American cities believed that cities needed to compete with the suburbs for manufacturing and commerce and new housing. And it was plain that cities couldn't compete against all that cheap land out in the suburbs, and urban renewal was in part an effort to assemble, under public supervision, large parcels of land for rebuilding at reasonable economic prices to build new cities. Now, eventually, urban renewal became public enemy number one for historic preservation. But the original idea was based in a national policy aimed at building better cities. Now, many of you could recite the things that presidents and Congresses did following Eisenhower. President Kennedy created what ultimately became the Office of Economic Opportunity. He gave life to the Federal Arts Program. His administration passed the Manpower Development and Training Act, which aimed at training people in cities to take advantage of job opportunities. Lyndon Johnson was famous for the programs he created for cities, programs involving everything from new urban parks to new rolling stock for city transit systems. His administration promoted the idea of multimodal transportation planning in urban areas, and new towns, real new towns, was a part of the Johnson administration, hence places like Weston popped up. President Johnson also sponsored a program that I knew as a young mayor's assistant as 701 Planning. It was a federal grant program designed to build the management capacity of American city halls. Cities were also an important part of the administration of Richard Nixon. Nixon sponsored the Housing and Urban Development Act, the Housing and Community Development Act, one of the first block grant programs. And another block grant program, 1973, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, sent billions of dollars to city halls to combat unemployment. The Nixon administration wrote the first checks for operating public transit systems. And revenue sharing, another Nixon-era idea, was a way to help cities. President Carter had a purposeful and remarkably well-conceived urban policy, which included the funneling of federal assistance to cities that would create comprehensive plans with neighborhood associations and voluntary organizations joined in formal union for the first time. President Carter promoted programs to combat urban sprawl. It's been a long time since the words urban sprawl were a part of the public dialogue. And it was that idea, the idea of combating sprawl, that helped pass the Community Reinvestment Act of 1978. By contrast, America's public policy in the 80s and 90s has not focused on the needs of people living in cities. And this evening I want to suggest to you 4 reasons why I think that has been so. I contend that the interests of cities have been under attack from both the political right and the political left, and that the result has been devastating. 4 ideas. First, less government is better government. Well, one rather well-known development was the decision of the Reagan administration that there ought to be less government, fewer government programs, and fewer government grants. You could go to meetings of urban types and people would get up and say, the Reagan administration has been cutting back aid to cities. Now, in truth, the Reagan administration didn't cut out very many urban programs at all, but they did do 2 things. One of those was to restrain what we had all come to think of as the natural growth in programs for cities. And they did resist creating new ones. And yes, they did actually abolish a few urban development action grants, for example. But Ronald Reagan didn't do that without our permission. It was what the country said it wanted. And it was harmful to cities. Point 2. More guns, more butter, less debt. The American right sold the nation on the idea that somehow we could have higher defense budgets, growing social programs, lower taxes, and lower deficits all at the same time. And Americans acted like they thought it was true. And we still do. We reward politicians who tell us we can have it all, and we punish office holders who make us pay for what we receive. And when that idea migrated from Washington to state capitals and city halls, local political figures found it politically difficult, if not impossible, to get Americans to pay the bills for the things Americans demanded. And that, too, has been harmful to cities. Third, the rights revolution. Activists on Americans' left have traditionally branded Ronald Reagan and George Bush as the villains responsible for the declines of urbanism. But people on the left have been unindicted co-conspirators. The next 2 items, it seems to me, illustrate the way in which their efforts have been damaging the cities in the 80s and 90s. At the time this country was founded, the prevailing political philosophy in the land was civic republicanism. Republicanism was the idea that individuals found in their role as part of the community their own worth. It was an idea not unlike the slogan on the Evansville ballpark: when everybody boosts, everybody wins. Americans built for the civic good, and all Americans found fulfillment in the achievement of the collective common good. By 1985, the idea of civic republicanism was all but dead in the land. Replacing it were ideas that were more individualistic. Americans' individual futures were to be found in claims that individuals made against the community. What is my right against the civic whole? This represented a complete reversal of the attitude that Americans would have taken in the fairly recent past. It was as though President Kennedy had stood on the steps of the Capitol and said, "Ask not what you can do for your country, ask what your country can do for you." An entirely different idea. The rights revolution promoted government entitlement programs under which the government increasingly wrote checks to individuals for private consumption. Money that might earlier have gone to city halls for job training or rebuilding infrastructure instead went to assure the broader purchase of consumer goods. And that has been bad for cities. Fourth, the assault on political parties. This is a somewhat more prosaic contribution of the American left. This development was a prolonged assault on political parties and the resulting decline in the parties as centers of power in the country. Last week's Time magazine was dedicated in part to this topic. Somebody recently mentioned to me an article in yesterday's paper about the coming convention, and someone recently mentioned to me the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. You can hardly speak about that event to anyone over the age of 35 without thinking of Mayor Daley. Richard J. Daley, the real Mayor Daley, pale substitute, acceptance. How you cannot think of that event? And this is the Richard J. Daley who said, "The police are not there to create disorder. The police are there to preserve disorder." Story of John. Riots in Grand Park. Where is he? Now, the great political machines of America survived in the 60s and to a certain extent in the 1970s. And they had a lot of negative aspects. But there was one thing that they did very well, and that was to accumulate political power and to put it in play for the benefit of people who lived in cities. Those political machines forced presidents and congressmen and legislators to tend to the needs of people who lived in cities. And in the 70s and 80s, the American left led a series of assaults on political parties. It canonized the Political Action Committee, which has become a major alter ego to political parties for the financing of campaigns, made candidates less dependent on the parties and more dependent on interest group committees. And they beat up on political parties in the Supreme Court of the United States. As the influence of political parties began to diminish, the ability of those parties to accumulate political power for American cities also diminished. And that too has been bad for American cities. Now, this 15-year downward spiral, I put it to you, a near evaporation of the concerns of cities in the national dialogue, moved Senator Bradley to go to the Senate floor 4 years ago this month for a remarkably prophetic address. The future of urban America, said Bradley, was going to take one of three paths. He called them abandonment, encirclement, or conversion. Abandonment, he said, means that all who are able to escape will flee the old cities in favor of corporate parks and shopping centers, the places we now call edge cities, leaving those who cannot move, the poor, the aged, the uneducated, fend for themselves. Encirclement, he said, means living in enclaves, building the racial and ethnic walls even higher than they are today, a kind of clockwork orange arrangement in which the rich pay for their own security, the middle class would continue to flee as it confronts violence, and the poor would be left behind to be preyed upon or to join the army of predators, as seem most likely to produce beneficial individual results. The third path is conversion, by which Bradley means nothing less than a comprehensive effort to reverse all the forces that have fueled the downward spiral in American cities over the last 45 or 50 years. I call Bradley's speech prophetic because it was given just weeks before the 1992 riots in Los Angeles. David Broder reported on Bradley's speech for the Washington Post under the headline, "Shame of Our Cities." Lincoln Steffens note. And he closed his report by saying, "None of this," Bradley says with bleak realism, "will happen without much stronger leadership at the national level. And just as important, stronger leadership in each neighborhood and community." The question is there the will and the interest to face that kind of challenge. It will take more than speeches by presidential candidates of the sort they tend to give when they're campaigning in the New York primary and other large urban areas. The truth is that the declarations of George Bush and Clinton and Bradley and Dole have not been enough to bring Americans around to the action that's required. But not long after Senator Bradley spoke, there was another kind of eloquence heard, one I'll never forget seeing. It was the elegance of Rodney King. As the death toll passed 40 in the riots in LA, Rodney King came out of seclusion onto the streets of Los Angeles. He looked into a battery of cameras and he said, "This isn't right. This has got to stop. It doesn't help. We can work this out. We have to. Because we're all going to be living here together." It was more to the point, and I thought more moving than anything the presidential candidates said that year. It described very well the civic ideal of an earlier time, not so distant in our nation's life. It described the reality that suburbs and cities are inextricably tied together, that their future is one and the same, that if Detroit dies, the quiet affluence of Bloomfield Hills will be intolerable, that if New York City dies, the beauty of Larchmont ought to be an embarrassment to everyone, or that if Chicago dies, the calm serenity of Lake Forest would be a national outrage. A presidential election is a moment in time when the nation can turn its attention to problems like these and talk about directions for the country's future. Preservationists and people interested in American cities, for all manner of reasons, ought to use 1996 as a moment to reclaim for people who live in cities the place they have always had on the national agenda. Thanks so much for inviting me to come and see you. It's been a great pleasure.
I think we have a little time for some questions if the Chief Justice will entertain them. Anyone?
Someone, sir.
Do you see any promising directions at the moment, or it's hard to say? A lot of enthusiasm.
I see a couple, and I'll mention one. One of the unusual features, and a very hopeful one, of the last, let's say, 4 presidencies, if you will, has been, notwithstanding what I said about the political pressure that the more guns, more butter, less debt theme placed on people involved in state and local government. There are a great many of those people who have stepped up to the plate and said, okay, so I'm not going to get more from Washington. What is it that I can do with the resources that I have? I'll give you just one little example. One of the things that happened when the 1986 Tax Act got passed, great effort to simplify the tax code by reducing the number of brackets, as though that was really the problem with the tax code. What was a very serious imposition of limitations on the availability of the investment tax credit, which had poured at its height $2 billion a year into the renewal of historic districts in this country, and now pumps something like 150 or 175 million a year instead. Not because the tax credit was abolished, but because the Congress adopted something called the passive loss rules, which was a device by which it was politically possible not to abolish anybody's tax credit, leave it all in the books, but make it so difficult to take advantage of the tax credit when you finally got down to doing your return that the government wasn't spending much money. Really a delightful idea, really very good. The Indiana General Assembly passed, for the first time, an investment tax credit for the rehabilitation of historic structures. Jim Glass was the director of the State Historic Preservation Program when that occurred. And so there are now places, including some places where you probably couldn't have used the federal credit at all, where the state government has been willing to step in and say, we've got a few dollars on the table, and it's not, the cupboard is not totally bare, and we're prepared to spend some of it for the revitalization of American cities. And our legislature is very good at this sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't get the kind of credit it deserves. One of the students asked me this afternoon, do I have any ideas about where to get money for the small city where she lives and where they have some projects they'd like to do? And I said, have you read our do you know what a tax increment financing district is? She didn't, and so we spent a period of time describing how you can, as my tax lawyer, my sister who's a tax lawyer would say, you leverage that money right up out of the ground. I mean, it's just like there's money there and you didn't notice it before. There really is money there if you know how to snatch it for this purpose instead of frittering it away that those other guys fight for it if they want to. So in our legislature, passed such a statute some time ago in downtown Indianapolis. It now generates $2 million a year that is plowed back into projects in the urban heart of the largest city. So one of the things that has happened is that there are state and local officials in quite a number of places who are doing things not only on financing but on land use and a variety of allied subjects that can make a difference. They're not as dramatic. One of the things they do is they don't carry all that incredible paperwork. This is one of the things I used to be very good at, was federal grant paperwork earlier in my career. I guess people would say I'm still good at paperwork. I created for others. But as a young man, I became very aware, universities had the same problem, the overhead required and the effort required to bring a dollar from Washington. All those things Ronald Reagan said are absolutely right. The carrying costs are very high. By contrast, the carrying costs for the Indiana tax credit project quite modest. And there are a host of other kinds of ways in which a state with our kind of surplus can continue to do things like that. And if there are people, I mean, if you look at some of the leading candidates for governor in our state, you have at least two of the leading contenders are people who really believe in the revitalization of inner cities. Believe it right to the core of their being. And who knows how the election will turn out, but we got a pretty good shot at ending up with a chief executive who has talent, interest, and commitment that's going to be favorable to places like Indianapolis and Muncie and Evansville, Fairmont. She's here this evening. Anybody else? Yes.
What do you think about the budget of Indiana the $100 million to the question as part of the urban enterprise, national enterprise?
I'm sorry, you're having to get...
Recent just passed. City of Detroit, I think last year, $100 million in kind of keeping the black list. How do you think about that in a city like Detroit?
Most of the people who run those cities today, Mayor of Detroit and I used to serve, he's a lawyer, he used to serve on used to serve on a committee together, and I saw him this last week. And most of the people who run cities today have become very entrepreneurial. And while I think most of the individual efforts, say individual programs, we committed $100 million to this or that, they do not individually change the landscape, but collectively, in the hands of capable people, they make the difference between growth and stagnation. And there are a lot of small efforts. I'll say the one thing that President Clinton has taken an interest in are community-based development banks. His wife served was a consultant to the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh for a period of time. It's a very interesting, rather lengthy story. But most people in America know it's the South Shore. Our version is the South Shore Bank in Chicago. A very labor-intensive banking enterprise aimed at making loans other people won't make and making money at it because they work with the borrowers. That's the essence of the difference. It had been on the president's agenda to finance community development banks all over America. It hasn't happened so far. A very promising idea, but I think that the fact is that many individual initiatives like that, there's still people spending money. The large foundations in America continue to make equity investments in inner cities. They continue to loan money that is re-loaned out in small loan pools and the like. And I think there's, without it, the job would be ever so much more difficult than it is to be otherwise.
I was wondering what other legal or financial mechanisms you're aware of that might be anti-urban that perhaps could be important.
Well, you know the list of suspects, and many people in this room would recognize it as well. One of the people who was kind enough to come to dinner was Charlie Satterfield, and we served on a committee together in the late 70s when Indiana had a full-fledged planning division that attempted to work on the impact of state programs in various fields. We went one time as a kind of a field trip to a place in rural, what I guess might have been called at some eras exurban southern Indiana. And the state, with money from the Farmers Home Administration, was making an investment, sticking water lines farther out into farmland in order to create the possibility for building homes. Net result, of course, just like the interstate highway system, making it possible for people to move out of New Albany and live in the burbs, leaving behind a weaker New Albany. And we had quite a discussion that day about whether that was really sensible public policy or not. I think to this day it was insane as a matter of public policy. It didn't make any sense to me in 1978, and it doesn't make any sense now. The political inertia behind that is next to impossible. That is, there is some point, I don't know what year it was, maybe ultimately historians will figure this out, but there came to be a point in America some years back when there were more of us on the tape than there were on the pay, right? And once that tipping point occurred, every effort to cut back the amount of the checks that were written to all of us, whether they were written through entitlement programs or written for audit grants, became an exceptionally difficult thing, as it seems to me the Gingrich Revolution demonstrates. That even that enormous political earthquake has been unable really to close the deal. And so I've sort of given up on that, frankly, in my own mind. It seems to me that the real trick for urbanologists is just be fleeter of foot and think of better ways to build a mousetrap.
But
You managed to hit on a topic that every once in a while, my regular line of work, judging, intersects with my avocation. And there is a case coming to us from the tax court on the constitutionality of the property tax system, so I better take a pass on that.
Concern. We think of the growth of cities in certain terms. We think of cities in certain terms, and you use the word growth, and the idea of rebuilding cities. And I'm wondering how far the vision of those two terms takes us into the future. And I'm referring specifically to issues that may or may not affect us very, very really in the immediate future. And that is the issue of energy availability and energy of non-renewable resources and so forth running the
Well, it seems to me I accept as a first principle that it would have been cheaper to use my water line case to continue to deliver water to the same family in the corporate limits of New Albany through the water line that we have already built and paid for than it would have been to extract more resources out of the ground, build more pipe, lay pipe, and make that expenditure. And I think you can, the economics of city development are sufficiently skewed in the modern world that many of the true costs and benefits do not appear in anything like a rational full accounting system would take. When I worked in City Hall, we used to have periodic arguments with people who lived in relatively new neighborhoods about why it was we were spending all this money to promote projects in downtown neighborhoods, and how come those people couldn't take care of themselves. Well, the truth of the matter was that those guys were driving to their shopping center on roads that the public had recently paid for, and they were flushing their toilets with sewer lines that the public had recently paid for, and there were a whole host of things that, if you really cost them out, it represented a considerable investment. And it seemed to me, as I said, it seems to me relatively unassailable that if one thinks about resources sort of wholly conceived, that the reuse of that ground in the center part of cities has to be, over the long run, better from every point of view, better economically, better from an environmental point of view. One of the recent destructors of cities has been an environmental program. I recently I did a rehabilitation of what used to be a single room occupancy. That gives it the benefit of the doubt, I suppose. Did a very large house that had been 13 one-room apartments and converted it back into basic middle-class market rate housing. When I sold it, one of the things that I was asked to do, this is a house built in 1867, one of the things I was asked to do was to warrant that there was no hazardous waste dump on this parcel. This has become a considerable barrier to people who want to reuse property that's been occupied and used by somebody else. They'll sign their names in a moment on farmland because they figure they're safe. But the lender wanted me to stand responsible. I signed my name too. I knew enough about the history of the city that I felt confident there would be no hazardous waste dump. But I was asked to warrant for a whole bunch of other things. And there are developers who simply throw up their hands and say, I don't want to fuss with that. I can go out, buy another cornfield, and do this, and not have to worry my lender about whether we're going to be on hope as a Superfund matter 10 or 15 years from now. More to say about that probably I haven't thought about that in context, but my off-the-cuff answer, worth what you've paid for it, is that in this context it would be harmful. For the reason that it would tend to disperse influence and make it tougher for the same group of people to make claims on the national agenda. That is to say, that one of the benefits of the American cities have been democratic cities for a long time. And it really hasn't been too harmful because they had a very serious power block inside the Democratic Party, so that at least in one of the two parties, you knew that somebody who ran for president had to come to terms with the mayor of New York, and the mayor of Chicago, and the mayor of Los Angeles, all three of which now have Republican mayors. No, two out of three. But the reality of those political leaders were forced to come to terms with the elected officials who represented people in those cities was a very important value for American cities. So that to the extent that proportional representation would fracture that voice, it seems to be harmful. Now, of course, what's happened in addition to the weakening of parties in general is that even to the extent that they still exist, there are more people who live outside the city limits than live inside it. So that the influence of people who live, even Democrats, who live in suburbs, and take a very different view of the calculation of what's beneficial is rather considerable. One of the most unusual things that happened about 3 years ago in the Indiana General Assembly was an amendment offered that was, shall I say, the simplest way, anti-annexation. It was offered by a Democrat. Politically counterintuitive, but the reason it was offered was because he had enough suburban Democrats in his district that it made sense from his point of view to be the sponsor. And of course, it doesn't take much to put up your hand and say, well, I've got a piece of legislation that's going to save folks from annexation. You don't have to do too much talking to sell that once you get it advanced on the floor. So I think that the value of the accumulation of that power would be diminished through something like proportional representation. Yes?
Where do you see as the strongest historic preservation and community redevelopment in your city?
Well, let's see. I need to describe that in two quick ways. One is that the essence of preservation for the folks I hang out with is that it is beneficial from a whole host of viewpoints to reuse existing structures. And the best community-based development that I've seen, more often than not, occurs in the same setting. And it can happen on bigger scales. There's a piece of legislation, really good idea for a piece of legislation in Indiana called the dinosaur law. Dinosaur law says if you've got these, this is the Rust Belt, right? We got these big hulks, like the Studebaker factories in downtown and South Bend. And if under certain conditions, we will, if you want to reuse them for manufacturing or commercial purposes, there will be automatic tax incentives that derive from the reuse of those structures. This was designed as really for Shadeland Avenue in Minneapolis, where approximately the same thing has happened. Nothing quite so dramatic as the Studebaker plant maybe. But the connection, to me, one can call that community development, or one can call it historic preservation. The technique is the same. The reusing of places where we have lived and worked on grounds that both confirm the sense of place and make sense as an economic matter. The second way I would describe it is this. We've all thought about this before. On the big commercial street near where I grew up in Evansville, 5 miles from downtown, we started off with a single shopping center in 1957, and now it looks the same as every other big commercial street. Is this Tuesday am I in Cleveland or in Muncie, or it all looks the same. One of the really distressing things about upscale shopping malls now is that they all too look the same. They all have Eddie Bauer and Banana Republic and stuff. It's exactly the same grill. Preservation stands for a different ethic. It stands in large measure for quality of design, quality of the history of the place, and it is a sense, if you stood on Main Street in downtown Evansville, as opposed to Green River Road, you wouldn't have the slightest doubt where you were. You would know that this wasn't Cleveland. And there are places in Cleveland where you can stand and know that you're not in Evansville. One of the problems that we talked about preservation commissions with graduate students this afternoon, some commissions get real aggressive about paint color, for example. I think that when I talk to preservation commissioners, I say, with paint, give them a big boundary. There are paint colors you got to turn down, but don't worry about paint. That's not the point. The point is, do the buildings continue to get reused? Are the materials faithful? Do you keep people from doing stupid things and carrying them away to the landfill? But a commission that gets real over-aggressive runs the risk. People used to say this on the street where my wife lived in Evansville. Somebody walks down the street, sees somebody doing something that she knows they don't have a certificate of appropriate use of a building permit to do, complains about it, and the line goes something like this: so what are you, the good taste police? And the answer is, within a certain boundary, you bet. Because we care what this street looks like, and we don't want it to look like Green River Road, because it doesn't look like anything. And this street is going to have on it, it's one of the great things about it. It's going to have this. What's going to happen on this street is that there are going to be people of substantial resources. There are going to be middle-class people. There are going to be people living in subsidized housing because the government has made it possible for that to happen in this neighborhood. And yes, we do care what this street looks like, just as people in the suburbs care what their suburban streets look like. So do we. But this has a distinction that does not routinely occur in those settings. It occurs in Seaside, to be sure, but in most places it does not. And the ability of cities to distinguish themselves as places that people would like to work and live and teach their children depends in part not on preservationists as good taste police, but I would offer up an alternative term: the quality cops. We're going to build something here. Can we build it better than that? Can it look more interesting? Can it not look the same? Or can we rebuild something else and use it instead of building new? And that, too, it seems to me, is a very important contribution that preservation makes to the rebuilding of cities as places that are more than just another tract, but rather have a history, a sense of place, and a sense of collective future, that there is a collective future for this circle of people. It is not so often the case as we are drawn up into little boxes out of numbers. Well, I think I have spoken long enough, but I have one thing to offer that I didn't expect. It came in this morning's mail. It happens every now and then as a trustee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They sent me a set of free 6-month memberships. And And I don't often know what to do with them, but when they came this morning, I said, I know exactly what to do with them. So